Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to People Making Money. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about all the matters related to business, professions, wealth building, the whole financial realm of life, and all the issues that play into it. So we talk about relationships, how to build professional relationships. We talk about, and today I'm going to be talking about negotiating. So what I found, especially over the last year that I've been working on this large estate, and there's so many different aspects to it, and so many different people involved, that really my ability to talk with people, negotiate with them in order to find solutions to problems that come up has never been more in demand than it is lately, and so I've had a chance to really exercise my skills, I guess is the best way to put it, and in thinking about it. I realize that the way I handle these things dates back to my reading of a book, and this is it in its original copy. You can see it's battered, but it's a book called The Art of Negotiating by Gerard Nierenberg. And this book was originally written in 1968, I think it was. Let me double check here. Yeah, 1968. And this particular version was published in 1984. I think that's when I read it. I want to say mid 1980s, when I was going through. I was getting ready. Actually, it's probably 1986 when I started my first company, and I realized I needed to improve my negotiating skills. This is really one of the classic books on negotiations. And so I thought I would spend a show talking about some of the principles that Mr. Nierenberg espouses. And as I was saying, much of the way I handle things is, I realized, based on the principles that I learned from reading this book. So we're talking, 40 years later, that's the impact that this book had on me, that I still look at this as the foundation for how I handle things. I was talking with one of my colleagues, I believe it was last week, and I was expressing frustration with the unprincipled way that another party was handling a negotiation with me. Frankly, just flat out lying is the only way to put it. And it's so counter to the way that I pursue a negotiation, and very frustrating. And so what I had to do was figure out a path that would allow me to continue the negotiation in a principled way, which was important for the party that I represent, but not having to deal, frankly, with this person who had shown me that he could not be trusted, right? And I think this is a core principle of not just negotiations, but relationships, in a broader sense, is when all is said and done, especially not especially, but in any relationship, but in a business relationship, if trust isn't present, so there's not a whole lot that can be accomplished very easily. I just had a meeting with a colleague prior to starting the show. It's why I was a few minutes late starting. And again, I'm in negotiations with someone who, frankly, I don't trust. The person has given me ample reason not to trust him, and so, as principled as I want to be in the way I negotiate, uh, I also have to keep in mind that whatever solution is reached, it has to be one where uh, there are strong guards in place so that I don't have to rely on the integrity of the other party in order to be reasonably assured that whatever agreement is reached is going to be acted on. So, and this is really the challenge with a negotiation. And um, when I meet someone with whom I'm going to be negotiating, and they start out by seeking to build rapport, then I almost always get a sense that, okay, this is probably a person who is more likely to be a principled negotiator, because they understand the value of the underlying relationship, the underlying sense of trust that's necessary, or I shouldn't say necessary, but that will drive, is more likely to drive a better outcome, I guess is the best way to put it. So all of that is by way of introduction. I'm going to take you through the core principles that Nierenberg, um, talks about in his book, The Art of Negotiation. The show is too short for me to, take you through a 200 plus page book. What is it? How many pages are here? Yeah, 240 or so page book. But you'll get, hopefully you'll get a feel for what Nuremberg is trying to teach, or is working to teach us, and that will motivate you to, get your own copy of the book and study up on it. So, um, the whole basis of his art of negotiation is that negotiation is a process, not a battle. Now, there are people who look at negotiations as a battle, and I think we have a you know a prime example of that as we look at how President Trump handles international relations. So, he stakes out a position, and then he says, if you don't do this, I'm going to hit you with big tariffs. And the other side, bluffs and blunders about it, and says nasty things, and then, basically they end up capitulating, right? That's negotiating as a battle. Now, certainly when one is negotiating in the, geopolitical realm, and when one is negotiating with opponents, or even enemies, the idea of having a sort of, collegial negotiation probably is not, going to happen. And it may not be possible even with allies, because in the end, geopolitical negotiations, or international relations, are fundamentally based on the power positions of the parties. And we can see for the United States how, when we deny the inherent strength of the United States, so then, or when we signal to the world that we're not going to use our strength for our own benefit, so then we end up basically being, you know, smoked at the negotiations table. We don't get anything like what we want. We end up in very difficult situations internationally. And I think that's because most, if not all, other countries look at it from the standpoint of, if I'm negotiating with the United States or some other country, I'm in it for what's best for my country, and that's just how we're going to deal with things. That's number one. And number two, because there isn't continuity of leadership. So, for example, in the United States, there's a new president elected every 4 years. The longest a president can serve is 8 years. So, a geopolitical opponent knows that to have a personal relationship of trust with an American president or a member of the president's cabinet um, is only a temporary situation. And when the administration inevitably changes, and even if it's a two-term president, and that president is succeeded by another president of his own party, still that's a different person, right? And it's a different person with whom trust would have to be established, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the assumption that all members of each party are exactly the same as the other members of their party is also not true, right? So by their nature, negotiations in international relations are probably more like a battle, a verbal battle, than they are a process. But in business, where there is much greater continuity of people involved, so then negotiation should be a process, because to beat up the other side until they finally submit to your will, it will, while you may in the end get the agreement you want, you're unlikely to get cooperation in the execution of that agreement. Okay, and then people drag their feet, et cetera, and then maybe the agreement is breached, and now you're faced with potentially having to litigate. All of that, from a business perspective, is a drag on the success of the business. And so, while excuse me. So while there certainly are businessmen, people in business who view negotiations as a battle, um, for building long-term relationships, and I believe that that's not the best way to go, because it's terribly hard on the people, and it doesn't engender a sense of cooperation in the execution of the agreement, which in the end, the end result of the negotiation isn't really the agreement per se, it's the benefit that comes from the agreement. So to bludgeon our way into an agreement only to, not have it executed well, or executed at all, the negotiation at that point has yielded little, if any, value. So, we Nierenberg talks about the idea of a win-win outcome, and that's why negotiation as a process is one where both sides have a sense that they have won at least some of the issues they sought to gain, and that wasn't necessarily at the expense of the other party, right? So, um, someone I've known for many, many years gave me his philosophy. His philosophy if both people come out of a negotiation feeling somewhat dissatisfied, then that's probably been a good negotiation, and it's an agreement that's going to hold. And in a way, I think he's saying something similar to what I'm saying in terms of a win-win situation. If one party feels that the other party has won at a big expense to his perspective, that agreement is less likely to hold. If both parties feel like, well, listen, I got some things, and I was willing to give them away for the things that I got, or I was willing to give away other things for the things that I got, and the other party feels pretty much the same way, and there was some give and some take, but neither side feels that the other side's winning came primarily, at their expense, but that they got a reasonable amount out of it. So that is probably the best outcome that you can get. If one party feels like I won, right, and the other party feels like, wow, I lost, that's not a good outcome. Okay, so the idea is to think of negotiation as a process that seeks to create a win-win outcome as opposed to a win-loss outcome, right? So those are the two sort of keystone principles that Nierenberg talks about, in his book, The Art of Negotiating. Okay, so the next thing is that we need to understand human behavior. So successful negotiation requires an insight into how people think, human psychology, if you will. So, when we're negotiating with another person, and by the way, it's why it's better to negotiate in person, or if not in person, in some sort of virtual meeting where you can see as well as hear the other party, because there's many verbal clues there's many visual clues that we can get that will help us assess where the other party is coming from, that we wouldn't pick up if we're on a telephone conversation where all we have is verbal clues, right? So we want the visual and the verbal together. And why I say face to face in the sense of live, that's even better, because there are, not to sound too woo-woo 1960-ish, but there are vibes that we can get from another person. Are they nervous? Are they anxious? Are they excited? That can also give us some insight into their thinking, into their mindset, and so we need to practice recognizing these visual, nonverbal cues that another person gives. And by the way, we can practice this. We don't have to be in a negotiation to practice these things. We can be, out to dinner with our spouse or with our friends, and we can be observing them as they speak and seeing, what other information can we pick up on besides the words that they're saying and the tone of what they're saying. What kind of body movements are they making? Where are they looking? How focused are they? What clues do we have about what they're feeling inside? So we can practice all of those things, and they become useful for us when we're in a negotiation. Okay, so we want to become students of human behavior, or studiers of studiers of human behavior, right? To understand the other side holistically, not just listening to what they say. Okay, next, we want to listen and observe actively. Okay, so if we're doing all the talking, we're probably not doing much listening, and we're not doing much listening, and we're probably not doing much observation as well. So we want to allow the other side to talk so that we can listen to them, we can watch them, and we can gather these clues about where the person is coming from beyond just what they're saying. Okay, so I spoke about, body language, tone of voice. Again, the understanding of human behavior is coupled with active listening and observing, right? So the two go hand in glove. One is what we're looking for, and the other is how we're going to gain that information. Okay, so again, this is something we can practice anytime we're with someone else. It doesn't have to be a negotiation, but we can practice sitting back and listening to them, observing them, assessing as we're listening what might be going on with that person. And then the next step in that is the power of questions. So one of the good ways to be a good listener is to listen to what the person is saying thoroughly enough to be able to ask them questions that will necessitate their expanding on what it is that they're saying. So, and this the ability to ask good questions is a key component of being an active listener, but it also impacts the other person by saying to them, wow, this person is really interested in what I have to say. They're really listening to me. Right. So by asking good questions, we're not just gaining additional information, we're sending a message to the other party, a message of a message of respect, and a message of a desire to really understand their perspective. Right. It's a much more powerful way questions are a much more powerful way to do that than to say, I hear where you're coming from. I mean, that's fine. To say that. There's nothing wrong with saying that, or I think I understand where you're coming from. That's fine. But to ask a question that demonstrates that you have some understanding and are seeking more understanding is an even more powerful way of doing that. Okay. Now, the key thing about asking questions is we want to ask open-ended questions. So to ask a question that has a yes or no answer actually tends to cut off communication, right? As opposed to asking a question where they have to expound further on their topic. So let me think of an example here. So let's say you're in a negotiation with someone and they're asking for a particular, let's say it's a negotiation over the sale and purchase of a property. And they say to you, well, I need to have 60 days in order to inspect the property, review all the records of the property, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so 60 days, 2 months, and you may be in a position where you really need to be able to close the sale in 45 days. So if the person has 60 days just to do their review, it's going to take another 15 to 30 days to close it. So we're talking 75 to 90 days, which is, roughly double the time that you have. So one thing you could say to them, one question you could ask them is, can you do it in less time? Okay. And the answer is yes or no. That's a closed-end question, yes or no. Rather than asking that question, you might ask, how could we create a situation where you would be comfortable with a shorter review period so that the transaction could happen more quickly? Okay. Now, that's saying to them, I on the one hand, I understand your desire to thoroughly understand the property before you commit to buying it. On the other hand, is there a way we can reach that point more quickly? And what role could I take in that to help you get there, right? This is the nature of a win-win negotiation, right? On the one hand, you're acknowledging it's a reasonable request on the part of the buyer to want adequate time to satisfy himself that the property is as it's represented. On the other hand, you're explaining, look, I need a shorter time frame to sell the property. So how can we get together on this so your need can be met to do a proper review of the property and my need can be met for a shorter closing time frame, right? So that's the power of asking open-ended questions to get the person thinking, well, is my need really that I need 60 days, or is it really that I want to make sure that I've reviewed the properly thoroughly? And the person might respond by saying, well, I guess if I had all of the information on day one and it didn't, trickle in, so I could, get the review done in 30 days, right? And so maybe the compromise is that the review period will begin will be for 30 days once all the information is received, right? And so now you've got a list of documents that you have to provide the buyer, and while the negotiation is going on, you can get your staff working on collecting all those documents. And so should you be able to come to an agreement, within a day or two, you can say, okay, here's all the information you wanted. Now the 30 days is running, and we're off to the races, kind of thing, right? And that hopefully would be the working out of a situation that's beneficial to both parties. Okay. So again, the power, ask questions, but ask open-ended questions that stimulate discussion as opposed to cutting it off. Okay, next, we want to be flexible and adaptable, right? And the example that I just gave is one of flexibility and adaptability. And by asking that open-ended question, you'd be conveying to the person that you're flexible and adaptable. So you're flexible enough to acknowledge that they have that they're that what they're asking for is reasonable, and you're willing to adapt to it to the extent that they exercise some flexibility as well, right? And so this is how we can potentially avoid a deadlock, or if a deadlock occurs, hopefully figure out a way around the deadlock or through the deadlock by looking for opportunities whereby each party adopts a little more flexibility in order to get to a resolution. Now, this is where, by the way, a mediator can be particularly useful. So if an important negotiation has reached an impasse, rather than give up on it, an option would be to bring in a neutral mediator. And what that mediator is going to seek to do is understand each party's perspective and then look for areas where each can exercise some flexibility and adaptability in order to meet each other's needs but in some way that hasn't been considered before, or maybe it's been considered before, but it hasn't been presented in a way that encourages the parties to exercise that flexibility. So we want to be looking for alternatives. Alternatives give us an opportunity to be flexible, and we want to be looking not only for alternatives for the other side to try and convince them, but we also need to look at alternatives that may be acceptable to ourselves, because one way around a deadlock may be to suggest an alternative way to handle something that we want, to show that we're willing to be flexible in exchange for the other side exercising some flexibility, right? So the flexibility flexibility and adaptability. They're key qualities to bring to a negotiation, in accordance with Nierenberg's philosophy in the art of negotiating. Okay, and then finally, we want to prepare. So we want to understand our objectives. We want to understand all our alternatives. We want to know what limits there may be before we enter the negotiation, so that we can be confident in presenting our position, but also we can be as responsive as possible to what the other side is proposing. And we want not only to be prepared on our side, we want to do as much research about the other party's needs and constraints as we can. The better we understand the other side's situation, the more effective we can be in coming up with alternatives that will help us reach the win-win outcome for which we're searching. Okay, so it's obviously it's much easier to prepare our side because we working with our colleagues, we can figure out what the constraints are. Okay, it's more difficult to figure out what the other side wants, but it's by no means impossible. So I'm in a negotiation right now where I ask the other side a number of questions to try and understand their situation, and the person I was negotiating with would not respond, and so in talking it over with a colleague, he mentioned to me, well, there's an underlying court case they're involved in, that this negotiation is an outgrowth of, and you can go look at the court record, and probably get a lot of information. And indeed, that I was able to get documents from the court that I think pretty thoroughly briefed me, if you will, on what their situation was and what their position, where their position is coming from vis-a-vis the issues on which we were negotiating, and that put me in a more confident position when I continued the negotiations, number one. And interestingly enough, what I found was I had to essentially bypass the first person I was talking to and go to his superior. When I started talking to his superior, I realized that the background I had gotten from reading the court documents, indeed, the assessment I had made about their situation was pretty accurate, right? So look, it's not always the case that there's an extensive court record that we can research in order to understand the other side. But we can contact people who may know the other side and may have some familiarity with dealings with them, these sorts of things. And that can give us some insight into where they're coming from. Okay, so those are Nierenberg's core principles, and then he also mentions some techniques or strategies, and I just want to mention a couple of them because I think they're very powerful. So one of them is silence as a tool. Okay, the tendency is to say something, and if the other party doesn't respond immediately, to fill in the silence. And to be a good negotiator, we have to get comfortable with the silence. Okay, so if we've said something that requires a response, the longer we're willing to sit silently, the more pressure is on the other side to say something. Okay, and it's a beautiful technique. Okay, because the other party if it kind of smokes them out. So if indeed they really are serious about negotiating, they can't sit there forever not saying anything. Okay, so if they don't respond at all to what you've said, you're also receiving important information, which is they really don't care about the negotiation. And so that kind of flows into another tool or another strategy, if you will, which is walking away. So if you've sat silently for, a couple, 3 minutes after making making a statement that requires a response, and the person does not respond, so then a good thing to say is, oh, okay, I guess you're not interested in continuing. Okay, well, fair enough. We're going to move on, right? And again, if they're not really that serious, so then they're going to say, okay, fine, we'll move on, right? And better to know that than to crowbar into some kind of agreement that the other side doesn't really want to perform. On the other hand, you're demonstrating that you are willing to walk away, shows the other side that unless they're going to negotiate in good faith, they're not going to get what they want, right? So when we signal to the other side that we have to have an agreement at all costs, we've basically weakened our position dramatically. Okay. So I think in any negotiation, we need to be very careful not to put ourselves in a situation where we have to reach an agreement. Okay. Because once we're in that position, the other party is going to have a lot more leverage, and we're not going to get nearly as much out of it as we would have. So there are times when we feel like I have to get this. There's just no other alternative. Rarely, if ever, is that the case. Okay, rarely, if ever. And it's usually something we've created in our minds, or it's something we've invested our egos into, and we don't want to take the hit to our ego by not having it come to pass. And so we need to deal with those issues internally in order to make sure that we don't trap ourselves. So I highly recommend to you The Art of Negotiation, again, by Gerard Nierenberg. I think I said Nuremberg before. It's Nuremberg. And there are a number of other wonderful books on negotiation. There's books by the fellows who were part of the Harvard Negotiation Project. I've read their books as well. So it's a must-have skill in business and professions, and it is something we can learn. It's not I mean, there may be natural negotiators, like children. They're natural negotiators, right? Because they're very focused on what they want. But in terms of negotiating in the business world, this is a skill that we can definitely gain and improve throughout our careers. Okay, so I thank you very much for joining me today, especially my live guests. I see my faithful folks up there. I have a little calendar up here. That's why I say up here. They're not on the screen where you can't see them. But I always a treat for me to see you there. So if you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, please feel free to drop them in the social media. Always happy to hear from you. My email address is there as well. You can always reach out to me. And this is my last show for this week. So I will be back next week on Monday at 10 a.m. with Trust and Estates Weekly. My guest is Hillary Cooper, and we're going to be talking about preparing for downsizing. It's one thing to deal with all the accumulation of personal property after somebody has passed away, but it's a good idea to get a head start on that while the person or people are still alive. And so Hillary and I are going to talk about that. On Tuesday is at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, Business Lessons from the Military. And what is my topic? It is, yes, I'm going to be talking about Billy Mitchell, one of the strongest advocates for air power in the United States. He had a very interesting life. He basically Well, I'm not gonna. I'll let you find out about it next week. So that again, that's business lessons from the military, 10 a.m. Tuesday, 10 a.m. Tuesday Pacific time. And then 7 days from today, I'll be back for the next edition of People Making Money. And then next week at Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time is my every other week show, Jiggers' Place, and I'm going to be talking about relationships. So we're going to have a cocktail and sit back and talk about relationships. And I'm going to ask you the question that I've asked so many times when I've done seminars on relationships, and that is, what do you think is the most important thing about relationships? Okay. And I'm guessing what you have in your head, and it's probably wrong. So join me next Thursday of next week, 5 p.m. Pacific time at Jiggers' Place. We'll have a cocktail and talk about it. So thanks so much for tuning in, joining me, and wishing you a wonderful rest of the day and week. And signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all.